to policy recommendations. And as a reminder, this summit is not for passive observers, and we will make sure that everyone has a safe and courageous space. At our first summit, we were able to identify 6 main issues, naming and addressing and enforcing DEI efforts. This includes the need to reframe diversity, incrementalism, failure to enforce rules, regulations, and practices. The second issue was racism and retaliation, including topics such as variant forms of racism manifesting on and off campus, micro and macroaggressions, and other topics. The third topic was recruitment and retention, subjects such as tokenism, lack of minority leadership, better recruiting policies for Black, Indigenous, and people of color and students, for faculty as well. Issues with the promotion and tenure process. The fourth topic was invisible and uncompensated labor, uncompensated DEI and social justice work, unrealistic service expectations for underrepresented faculty. The fifth topic was barriers to shared voices and power, the need for shared governance, the discussion around people in power who are deeply embedded in the system, lack of coordination of DEI efforts and groups. And our final topic was white fragility, defensive instincts and problematic reactions related to addressing racism, roadblocks to progress, and unclear roles of allies. As we gather here today, we have a unique opportunity to hear voices. And I want to leave you with a quote before I introduce you to Dr. Lori Andrus, who's going to take over from here. So the quote is, "No matter how big a nation is, it is no stronger than its weakest people. And as long as you keep a person down, some part of you has to be there to hold him down. So it means you cannot soar as high as you might otherwise." From Marian Anderson. Lori, I'm turning it over to you.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. I appreciate that. And I am really happy to be here with friends and colleagues that I work with. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm going to share screen and put up a slide. Can someone let me know that they can see the slide? Great, thank you very much. 2 summers ago, I attended the Columbia Oral History Summer Institute to learn about how to use oral history as a tool in my research. I left that program greatly impressed with the depth and range of the variations of oral history and its ability to inform activism, inform issues of power and social injustice, and to drive change. During that summer, I was also fortunate enough to meet many talented oral historians, one of which you will be hearing from shortly. What I want to do now in a timely manner is ground our effort today, the rationale for today's event. As we have planned today's event, there have been questions about the goals and the purpose. People have said, why stories? What's the significance? Are they really going to make a difference? Why would we bother with this? Let me present a few ideas about voices, experiences, and stories. Translating voice into influence requires more than simply capturing what people want to say. It involves efforts from above and from below. From within a system and its leadership, responsiveness is contingent on wider institutional changes and the political will to convert professed commitment to participation into tangible action, a theme that we're going to touch upon today, action. To secure action from the professed commitment from leadership, strategies that look like participation are required, but therein lies the issue. What does that participation look like? Well, Convenings like this that work from below are integral to not just agreeing and rubber stamping projects, but rather to exert pressure for change. Both of these processes, change at the top plus pressure from below, along with a two-way dialogue, take investment, time, and persistence. They cannot be achieved by waving a magic participation wand. Today, we are inviting you to consider the bold and upfront presentation of stories using a variation of oral history alongside the opposite of acknowledgement of experiences through the concept of whitewashing. We will examine this concept more fully during the keynote presentation, but think with me for a minute about this notion of whitewashing. Generally, whitewashing as we use it for our purposes is covering up, hiding stories and experiences. Why would that be done? What's the benefit? Is there a benefit to the powerful and harm to the less powerful? Consider this notion. If time and effort are made to exclude stories and experiences from the record of history, whitewashing narratives and experiences, may we assume that there must also be power and influence in our stories and experiences? One example is the significance of the idea of a colorblind society. If stories and experiences of racism are excluded, how then do we substantiate a call for practices and policies to address racism if we live in this colorblind society? Another example, if stories and experiences of racism are banned, how then do we display the significance and magnitude of disappointment, anger, a sense of invisibility and exclusion that underrepresented groups feel within this space? We invite you today to consider these experiences as radical rhetorical tools that have the power to create new thoughts and action about racism and strategies to combat its presence. Thank you for being here today. I invite you to join with us in this experience, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Kerry, to present our goals and ideals and a few of the kinds of rules that we're looking at for maximum participation today. Kerry?
Thank you, Lori. Let's see. I'm going to share screen with all of you. So just some norms. These were norms that we also talked about during our first summit, especially when we go into our breakout rooms, some things to keep in mind in terms of having a discourse that's productive for everyone. One is to listen respectfully without interrupting, listen actively with an ear to understanding versus thinking about what you're going to say while someone's speaking. Commit to learning, not debating. Comment in order to share information, not to persuade others. Be mindful of criticizing ideas and not individuals. Avoid blame, speculation, inflammatory language, and avoid assumptions about any member of or generalizations about a social group. And please don't ask individuals to speak for their perceived social group. And most importantly, allow everyone a chance to speak. We have quite a few folks on this Zoom call, 73 right now. And when we do go into our breakout rooms, it'll be important to make space for everybody to share. Another thing just to keep in mind, we wanted to make this Zoom space accessible for everyone, especially as we seek to involve our community into this space. Because of that, you have a lot more freedom in this Zoom space than maybe some others that are more webinar structured. So everyone was placed on mute when they came in. If you do want to speak, you should see a toolbar where you can raise your hand. It'll look something like this. In your toolbar, you'll see sort of a raise hand icon. If you want to chat, you can find the chat feature as well. It looks like this. Feel free to use that. And just so everyone knows, we're always at risk for having someone come in. I guess the term is Zoom bomber. If that happens, the plan that we have in place is to put that person into the waiting room. The benefit of that is that they're kind of in a holding pattern, so they can't just come back in right away. So just know that's our plan. We are going to use breakout rooms a little bit later in this session. You will actually be able to select your breakout room instead of being sort of forced into a particular room. When it's time to break out, I'll open the breakout rooms and you'll see a description of one of the 6 critical issues. There's also a 7th breakout room that's for students only. And this is just to relieve possible power dynamics, instead of having students in rooms with folks that might be their professors or administrators. I think that's it. Let's see. If you do need help while you're in the breakout room, there is an ask for help button as well. I'm going to stay in the main room. If you ever feel uncomfortable while you're in the breakout room, please feel free. You have the option to just come back to the main room and I'll be here. Okay. That is it.
Thank you, Kerry, for that overview of the norms that we're using to move the summit along. I believe at this point, we are going to move into our keynote presentation. I would ask that if anyone has any questions at this point, that they put them into the chat. Kerry and Stephanie, am I following the agenda? I don't have it in the front of me.
You're doing great.
Okay, good. All right, so I'm going to move into the presentation of our keynote speaker. And it's my pleasure really to introduce this person. I met so many wonderful people the summer that I was at Columbia, and she was one of the outstanding people that I met, and has really made her way in the world based on her unique skills and characteristics that she brings to the practice of oral history. Our featured speaker and facilitator is Alisa Ray Thunderberg, and she's a graduate of the Oral History Master's Program at Columbia. And she's also the oral historian for the Margaret Walker Center at the HBCU Jackson State University in Jackson, Mississippi. She maintains an oral history archive dedicated to the preservation, interpretation, and dissemination of African American history and culture. And that's a very short introduction. I think that there's just so much more to her skills and what she brings to us today. And without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you, Alisa. Thank you.
Thank you, Lori. That was a great introduction. I appreciate it. I'm very happy to be here today, and I really look forward to interacting with this great group of participants that you've gathered here. I'm sharing my screen, and today I want to talk to you all a little bit about connecting lived experience to action, specifically using oral histories. So how can we use oral history and interviewing across difference to make substantive change? Excuse me. Before we get into the change-making part, I want to ground us all in a common definition of what oral history is, and that's the collection and study of historical information using sound recordings of interviews with people having had personal knowledge of past events. And I want to clarify here that past events includes a person's own life history and the current experiences that they're going through. Everything we do up until the moment the words come out of our mouths eventually becomes a part of the historical record. It becomes a part of the past. So you'll see a lot of oral histories being done on COVID-19, which is an ongoing pandemic, because it is a part of a historical record. oral traditions have obviously existed in various cultures for centuries all around the world, but they've previously sort of been overlooked as a serious field of inquiry or methodology because of their attachment to words like mythology, folktale, folk tradition, old wives' tales, for instance, but it's largely become a more academic field since the modern concept of oral history was established by Alan Nevins in the 1940s at Columbia University. And since that founding, the world's first institutional home of oral history, the Center for Oral History at Columbia, has been a resource for scholars, students, activists, artists, all sorts of people coming to New York City or virtually now, especially. The Columbia Center for Oral History holds upwards of 20,000 hours of recorded and transcribed interviews and is consulted constantly. Thanks to the methodology's interdisciplinary nature, this rich and beneficial methodology of collecting and preserving histories is now not only recognized as a quickly growing field of study in the academy, but a useful tool in a variety of other professions like activism, art, documentary film, education, journalism, literature, museum exhibitions especially, and also a lot more now, podcasts. It is often considered radical for its, considerable focus on listening to marginalized people especially, and marginalized communities. In order to really diversify the historical record and bring attention to the intersectionality of each of our narrators or interviewees' personal identities. Other qualitative research methods like ethnographies and participant observation and focus groups especially are all really closely related to and complement this field of oral history interviewing. Outside of academia, it has been and continues to be a mainstay of Indigenous communities, especially, and it's used to not only tell and preserve their stories, but also as a tool for resistance. It has been an important tool for others as well. And the goal of a good oral history interview, what makes it different from entertainment or journalism, for example, is the intent to create a safe space, often informed by an understanding of trauma. This way of documenting a story allows for an emotional connection, not just between the narrator and the person interviewing them, but between the audience and the narrator as well after the fact. And that emotional connection isn't something you'd be able to achieve in a typical Q&A or a survey you do with students after class or after a semester ends, right? Some of the key terms and questions that we consider as oral historians when we're doing this work are intersubjectivity and intersubjective distance and intersectionality. Intersectionality specifically being the oppression and discrimination that results from the overlap of an individual's various identities. For instance, myself being both Black and a woman, and the different types of discrimination I might face at the same time for that. Also difference, community, equity, and by equity, I'm talking especially as it compares to the idea of equality, something that is fair and just versus something that's, just alike in quantity, degree, or value. Another key term for us, again, is empathy and misrecognition. You'll also see on this slide some of the common questions we consider as oral historians and that we ask our narrators to even consider prior to sitting down to do an interview. These are the things that shape the types of conversations we want to have and the way we want to record history. How do we bring equity and difference into an interview? And what do we need to do outside of the interview ahead of time to make sure that we're addressing intersectionality correctly? as the field grows, even beyond the academy, there is an increasing amount of attention devoted to the themes of repatriation, restitution, and race, and the ways in which our oral history methodology can be used to increase recognition of these things and eventually affect change. So why are oral histories useful? A couple of examples are here. As an academic field, it is really leading the way, as I said, in discussing some of these important issues that we're thinking about today. Outside of the university structure, it's been used in First Peoples land claims cases in Canada and South African post-apartheid truth and reconciliation processes, and recording the survivors' stories from brutal military regimes like Myanmar or Burma. And even here in America, and really around the world, in the form of narrative medicine, it's an approach that aims to change the way care is given and received by really listening to the stories of patients and patient families in order to make the care better. Oral histories are really making their way into these places, these courts of laws and medical journals, because they allow narrators to tell their own story, not guided by any other agenda, plan, or preconceived notion. And they're intended to preserve the perspective of this marginalized or non-dominant narrative, because if we don't record it, they'll say it didn't happen. That's long been the case, especially for Black people in America. Oral history allows others to understand not just the facts of a story, but empathize with the person telling it. It makes it more memorable than simply reading something abstract or listening to it or even seeing a story being told. It sticks with you more. And so the question of today's summit is, what happens when stories are silenced, taken out of context, and or misunderstood? And as Lori mentioned earlier, an example of what can happen if we go too long without setting the record straight is a whitewashing of history. And I'm sure all of you are familiar with the term, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, I have a couple of examples here from textbooks. Textbooks are the way that we teach our children. And so we all know what we learn as children generally stays with us, whether we actually believe in it or not, for the rest of our lives. So learning about European settlers arriving and First Nation people agreeing to move to different areas to make room for them is an example of a whitewashing of history. Here is another example from a textbook describing lynching. Another describing the patterns of immigration that brought slaves to America, calling them workers. And I just want to briefly talk a little bit about these things. For instance, the lynching. This tiny paragraph in a huge textbook of American history is all that's said about a major subject in American history, not just in the South. And it describes it as only a period of time of 10 years between 1982 and 1882 and 1892, where I'm sure we're all well aware that is not the case, that lynching existed outside of the South, that it existed outside of that 10-year time frame, and that it continues to exist today, that many people were killed through lynching, not just 1,400 African-American men and women, but also Mexicans and Chinese people in the Northwest. And really, African Americans only make up, I think, about 3/4 of the amount of people lynched, although we'll never know for certain because there were no records. So to try and quantify that in a small paragraph in a textbook is a pure example of a whitewashing of history. And I'd be happy to provide the links that these textbook images come from and more articles about it for anyone interested in the chat towards the end of our summit today. Moving on, I'd like to talk a little bit about how we can apply oral history practice specifically to campus diversity and equity. I have a little bit of experience in this, having been a part of a project called the Columbia Life Histories Project at Columbia University, which tried to do exactly this, and I believe was somewhat successful. This project was initiated in the fall of 2016 specifically for the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences, not the entire university. But the goal of the project was to conduct oral history interviews as a step towards cultivating a more actively inclusive campus environment. The project was significantly inspired by the racially charged conflicts that transpired at the University of Missouri and Yale the semester prior. And the project included multiple phases, multiple series of interviews and follow-up interviews. Phase 1 having produced 33 interview sessions with 18 self-selected students, so students who volunteered to be a part of this process and share their stories, having seen a call to do so as a poster or an email through their campus listservs. I'm going to share a separate screen so that you can see more details about the project. The Columbia Life Histories Project has a website that I'd be happy to also place in the chat for you all to peruse at your leisure. And you can see the many examples of stories that we've collected and the interview metrics that we have after the end of all the interviewing. You'll also see the goals of the project here, which was a larger, more thorough analysis of the collection of interviews and a report eventually that was submitted to the dean of the school. And that report was used not just for his sake to be more knowledgeable about the issues at hand and what his students were facing, but it was also shared with various bodies on campus, various offices like the Office of Mental Health and Columbia's diversity offices specifically. And just going back to my other screen. The project also included, in its second phase, a round of interviews purely of Black students as opposed to any students who wanted to talk about the issues of race. And the second call for interviews resulted in a lot more nuanced stories of how being Black on a campus, a college campus, a university campus, specifically affects students and affects their ability to do the work that they're on that campus to do. And so I highly recommend, if you have the time, to review it at your leisure and learn more about that project specifically. But I tell you about this project because I believe it's a great example of something that could be done for West Virginia University. In the span of a week, I conducted a small series of very short interviews with some volunteers from the West Virginia University community, supplied in part by Lori and Stephanie and their whole team. These were women of color, and they volunteered because they wanted to share, they really wanted to share their own personal experiences related to this theme of diversity and equity on campus. There were some stories that were even submitted anonymously, so not done directly through my own oral history interviewing, but done in writing as a result of the previous summit. And so as we move on into the rest of our session today, I wanted to create an opportunity for you all to really listen and hear a few audio clips of these stories from students, faculty, staff, and community members, because they really deserve to be heard, listened to, and contemplated rather than simply overlooked or brushed under the rug as like so often happens to the testimonies of Black women in this country. And so I am going to share another screen with you all. And that is a SoundCloud account that I've created specifically for this purpose. Hold on. Sorry. A SoundCloud account I created for this event that has a playlist of all of the clips that we're going to share with you all today. So now I think this should work. Okay. And so I'm going to play these clips in a specific order, and that's just first the clips that I specifically got from the interviews that I conducted, and then we'll also have our another guest speaker who I'll introduce after the first 5 clips. So share. Before I start playing, it would be good for us to take a moment to ground ourselves and really practice the act of listening. And so one of the things we can do in trying to be more active listeners is taking a moment and finding where we are, feeling our bodies, our presence, who we are, and just relaxing in that. And so if you'd all take a moment, if you're comfortable with either closing your eyes or just lowering your gaze, sort of like meditation, and just thinking about what you hear right now in your own space. And that could be the sound of your refrigerator humming. It could be the sound of the heat coming on and the air coming into your room. That could be, if you're in a city, the sounds outside your window, or if you have pets. I want you to feel your toes, feel your fingertips, feel the warmth of your own body as you're sitting in your seat. Maybe adjust your seat. Get a little bit more comfortable in how you're sitting. All right. And now I'm going to actually share my screen properly again, and we'll begin to listen to these clips. Share sound. Okay. And so I like this idea of introducing the person who's speaking after you're listening, because I think everyone deserves our full attention, no matter who they are. And I don't want to give us the impression that because someone has 30 years of experience, now I want to listen more fully or more actively. I want us all in this room to be in the practice of giving our full attention and our empathy and our commitment to hearing to anyone who is willing to share their stories with us. And so moving on to our next clip, that is from Belinda. And here it goes.
When everything happened with the George Floyd situation, and like the unrest kind of hitting its critical moment, and our department just kind of being silent. And at that point in time, and even now, I'm still active on Twitter. And I started to like become more active on Twitter and start to kind of call out the department a little bit for this. And Amber and I even sent an email to them being like, why is there no statement coming out? Like, again, like, why are we not getting supported? So like dealing with that, with like, I'm trying to graduate. The country is literally in flames. And our department is just saying nothing, like as if academia is untouched. So like being in academia and seeing that the outside world is in shambles and everyone kind of ignoring it was like a difficult part for me in 2020. Seeing like just like, oh, we're just gonna keep going as business as usual, and it's like that's That's not how that works. I'm a Black person. I'm a person first before I'm a scientist. And so it's kind of like starting the department to kind of like realize like you have people here who identify with the situation that's going on, and you're not saying anything about it just because we're not in a great number, because we're one of few and it feels like we're being ignored. That was another painful lesson that I had to learn last year. So now things are, I want to say things are getting better, but it's kind of like things are okay in the sense that the department is, during that time, they started holding race discussions, like talking about race and stuff like that, which on paper sounds really nice, but I viewed a lot of what they were doing as very much performative allyship. A lot of it was like, let's talk about it, let's see how it is, without really doing anything about it. And a lot of it was prompted by us saying something, so it just still feels even more disingenuous. And so that was just a lot. So at some point, I just started to remove myself from even wanting to be involved, because I felt like all I'm going to do is just feel continual disappointment. Like I already felt so much disappointment from the university and our department not doing anything about my own personal situation, to the point where like this is something that's affecting the Black population, and in particular, you have Black students in your department, and you're not saying anything, and you're not really doing anything, and then asking us to come and talk about our experiences, it feels wrong. It feels like bile in the mouth.
So that was Belinda, and as you can probably tell from the clip, Belinda is a PhD student, and I think in listening to Belinda's clip in particular, you can see the nuance of the story she's sharing, more than if she were to simply write out her story or to try and put it in a concise email for someone. She has the room in an oral history interview to really sit and think, to pause, and to share all of the details that she feels are important. She's not being led by a specific question that she has to refer back to or ground herself in. She has the room to share the story as she sees fit. And moving on to our next clip, we have Amber.
Yeah, at the time everything happened on a scale of like 6 months. Once everything finally like blew up, because it was me and another student who went through all of the things, and me and her were the only 2 Black students in the department, and we both worked for the same advisor. And we were both fired in the same email at the same time. And because we were we ended up being best friends. So because we were very close, when she went through something, we talked about it together. So I guess we kind of were the person we went through when things got frustrating. And because like some of the classes I took in undergrad, compared with some of the things that were said in high school about treatment and stuff like that, I was like, he can't say this or do this, and it's not fair. Because one of my biggest problems was he wanted me to keep a research journal of the things that I was doing, which I'd already started doing and had done, but it wasn't super detailed to the level he wanted it. He wanted me, before asking him for help, he wanted me to prove that I had looked at references, talked to other people, blah, blah. And in that meeting, I told him, you're the last person I go to for help, because he's not helpful. But he wanted proof that I was doing all of those things, which he didn't require from his other grad students. He didn't require them to prove that they were doing that, which was my problem, which apparently nobody got. Like, I didn't have a problem with keeping a research journal or having him see it. I had a problem with me needing to prove that as a second-year grad student, I'm doing all of these things before asking him for help. Like, I shouldn't spend 2 weeks on one problem. I should spend a couple days on one problem and then ask you for help.
And so, as you'll probably have gathered from the content of this clip, Amber also a student, was friends with the speaker of our former clip, Belinda, and they were the two students who were going through this problem at the same time. I think actually listening and not just thinking that we know because we've heard or read a similar story before is one of the key reasons I do oral history, to show the difference. These are both two young Black women, both studying science, you know, and it would be easy to think that their stories are the same or similar enough that we don't need to listen to both. But we really do, because they're individuals and they're affected differently, and their trajectories after this event and after their interviews even are going to be completely different. Let's move on to another clip. This is also from Amber.
Because we had each other, it's not as bad. We had someone to talk to about things we were going through, though we might not have realized were as bad if we were on our own. So in the department, the students are great. They don't really care, and I interact more with the students than I do with faculty members anyway. So the students are super supportive. So it wasn't being bad. It wasn't bad being one of the only. But in grad school, you kind of don't really interact with most of the university anyway. But the university isn't like, hey, you're one of the, like, you're a minority in this demographic, here are some resources. They're kind of just like, hey, you're coming to this university, you'll figure it out. So really, it was just like us, and that's it.
And now I have just one more clip that I'll be playing for you, and this comes from Shaylin.
I sit down, you know, and I look around, and initially it's not something that I ever paid attention to, but I started to get more involved in my major, and I'm going into these classes that are more concentrated, and I'm sitting down, and nope, like, it's just, in terms of people of color, it's just me. I'm the only person in there. You know, I look around, and it's just an uncomfortable situation. To be honest, I think that growing up, I guess I didn't realize that it was you know, the lack of representation of a person like me or people like me. And once I got more educated on certain situations and concepts, like going to class, and then you really have your eyes open and you notice, and you know, I guess it just kind of causes these feelings of like, wow, really, it's just me here. It's just me. There's nobody, you know, and like nobody reaches out, kind of, for the most part. You can maybe hear conversations around you, you know, when you're in class, and maybe it's just like you said with the election, maybe the political climate. I mean, on the campus, maybe you do hear things like around you, you know, you hear conversations that may not be directly towards you, but you know, you hear people talk about things and they may make you uncomfortable, you know, and I think definitely the election and things like that had an effect, even though most of it was virtual. The thing, I can't recall it all the way, but there was a video that I saw on Twitter, maybe, and it may have been during like the I don't want to say it if I'm wrong. I think it was during the BLM protest. Either that, or it was just even the reaction to when they tried to do the drag story time.
Okay.
Like the reaction from the town, like the people in the town, and like the way that it was, and maybe even like stupid comments on Facebook. You know how you get on Facebook and see literally stupid, just crazy hateful things on Facebook sometimes in the comment section of like news articles. I guess maybe like even random people, random residents of Morgantown, like people that I don't even know who they are, but just, you know, you can kind of pick up on the comment of an area. That's a fun thing to call people nowadays, you know, people who are tired of dealing with situations that people have been dealing with for years and ways that things are handled and just systematic problems. But now when people call them out, they're snowflakes or sensitive, you know, or you get hurt by everything. It seems like that
get
word
over
is used
it.
a lot. Yeah, get over it. It's not that big of a deal. It was just a joke, you know, things like that, I guess.
So thank you all for taking the time to listen to those clips. I recognize now that before I went into the clips, I didn't really give a space for you all to ask any questions you might have had specifically about oral history work. And so before we get to the anonymous recitations of some of our other stories, I wanted to create that space now. If you would like or have any questions, to go ahead and put them in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer them for you all. If you would like me to go into anything more specifically, I can also do that as well. All right. So given that I'm not seeing anything in the chat, we're going to move on to our anonymous clips. And to perform a recitation of those anonymous clips, we have a special guest joining us today, and her name is Doris A. Fields. Doris A. Fields is a native West Virginian and a professional vocalist, actor, songwriter, director, and promoter. She has toured with her one-woman show, The Lady and the Empress, a musical stage play based on the life and music of blues legend Bessie Smith. In 2008, her original song, Go Higher, was chosen as the best Obama inaugural song. Miss Fields is going to do some brief recitations of anonymous stories also presented by Black women from WVA, WVU, excuse me, all these acronyms. And she'll just briefly say whether the person was a student, faculty member, or staff or community member prior to each recitation. So you'll be able to recognize the different stories she's sharing. Doris, are you ready?
I am ready. Thank you, Alisa.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll just get right into it. African American woman faculty. You know, I think I can't stress the importance of having some sort of faculty of color network, but you know, for the most part, I need people who are interested in solving problems, not just talking about it. And I feel like having sort of a network of Black and Brown scholars at the university level that had some power to say, these are the changes that need to be made, and we should be moving forward with this in this direction, and really having real leadership behind it. Because, you know, I look across the campus and the number of Black and Brown faculty we have in those higher positions, like in dean positions and higher administrative positions, is pretty small. So we need that kind of leadership. African American woman faculty. I used to participate in many leadership trainings for women at WVU. I gave them up for several reasons. First, it became apparent that any needs or issues I had as a Black woman were not on the agenda. Another assumption of these meetings was if you only knew how to present your issue, then you would be listened to by those in power. Black women have never been quiet or shy or unwilling to speak. It never occurred to them that when Black women speak up, they had no protection and or were already made invisible as if non-existent. The last defining moment came when I saw how this gathering of white women assembled to consider inequities was unable or unwilling to recognize inequalities across the system in which we were all attempting to navigate. In particular, that they had another person of color waiting on them, circling the room to ensure their comfort in an invisible way, created in me such a great sense of alienation and sadness for this group of women who were simply reinforcing the system they wanted to change. African American woman faculty. At the departmental level, there is no tangible support beyond statements and platitudes. A lot of my frustration with society right now has been compounded by the department because we put statements out that talk about the injustices in the criminal justice system and inequality broadly, but there's no action behind the words. So that has just become a source of frustration. I'm tired of meetings and statements. Let's do something. Recently, we were having a discussion around hiring more Black and Brown faculty, and there was a suggestion made that, well, yeah, we could do that, but can we do another search at some point because we wouldn't want to sacrifice a position? Those sort of racist statements smack me in the face because I'm living in this world as a Black person. Meanwhile, many of my white colleagues didn't hear it, or at least they claimed they didn't. You know, I have to function in this country that caters to white supremacy. And then I come to my job and it's more of it. It's not less. It's not a refuge for me. It's more of the same. And even worse because it's my workplace and I can't really escape it easily. So, if anything, my home department just adds to the problems I have to contend with as a Black person in America. African American woman faculty. We started a diversity working group, and then we asked for it to be a committee. The faculty responded like we were asking to hold a conference on the moon. It's really not a radical idea. We're not the first to have a departmental diversity committee. The whole thing was very traumatic to me. Like, you don't even want us to have a committee to deal with race and ethnic issues in our department? That's problematic, you know? It's just layers upon layers of trauma all the time. I cringe going into our faculty meetings because I don't know what people are going to say. I don't know what's going to be allowed to be said. You know, those sort of things. There's no guardrails. African American woman community member. Well, I feel like in general, I feel like in the workplace, Black women cannot show any emotion unless it's happy or silly. I feel like if we're frustrated, if we're angry, if we're upset, if we're a little perturbed, it gets taken wrong and you get labeled angry Black woman. You know what I'm saying? So I had to work through that. I got kids. I had to work through that. By that Monday, once I walked out of their office, I was over it. I shut that down. Y'all are not going to bait me into turning up and being this angry Black person because they used to say it to me like, oh, I was waiting for you to go off on her. But why would I do that at my job? Who does that? African American woman staff. I had an incident with a patient and her family that ultimately displayed white privilege, racism, and lack of support on behalf of my organization to recognize the signs of microaggressions and deal with them appropriately. I worked with a patient without any incident. She was scheduled to go home that day. I asked her if she wanted to get cleaned up and get dressed, and she replied no. Sometime later, her family arrived, and her son, a very tall, heavy-set man who looked to be in his mid-50s, approached me at my desk and talked to me while I was sitting down. I had worked there a long time, and I knew he wanted me to feel intimidated. I felt okay, but I did not understand his demeanor, especially having had no incidents with his mother. I did not know whether he was a rude person generally or was targeting me. But I was not intimidated and refused to have my feathers ruffled. So I had a hard time judging his approach to the conversation. He asked if I was working with his mother, in which I replied that I was. His demeanor and tone was very sharp and rude with me. He stated that his mother wanted to get cleaned up and dressed. With a look of confusion, I stated to him that I had just asked his mother and she refused, and he very sharply replied, "Well, she does now," and turned to walk away. Still sitting, I immediately addressed his behavior toward me and told him that he was being rude. I said, "Sir, that is so rude." Approximately an hour later, my coworker came and wanted a report because she was taking that patient from me. I was shocked because usually the charge nurse would inform you of any changes. So I inquired of my coworker, why were they switching this patient? And my coworker told me that the charge nurse had met with the patient and the manager on call. Now I can feel myself getting upset because my charge nurse did not inform me that there was an issue, that she contacted the manager on call and that she was changing the assignment. The manager on call, whom I have a wonderful relationship with, she works on another unit, eventually came to me and asked if she could talk to me. I briefly met with her and the charge nurse. The patient's son complained on me, but there was an entire laundry list of complaints. I was accused of being cold, insensitive, indifferent, rude, like a person who only works in the hospital to get a check, but didn't care about patients. And the list goes on. Being totally floored and blindsided by these complaints from a patient that I had no issues with at all, being the second day that I had worked with her, I denied every allegation and refused to accept any of the complaints attributed to me. I said, "Are you kidding? Absolutely not. I do not agree and I do not accept any of this." Because I did not agree with the manager, she automatically got defensive and replied, "I'm not going to argue with you." I immediately addressed that statement. I told her because I do not agree with erroneous complaints against me that are untrue and unfounded, you automatically label me this, you automatically label this an argument as if I'm the angry Black woman. She then goes on to tell me the patient's son is friends with someone who sits on the board of governors. Again, I immediately addressed this comment. Who they are connected to is of no concern to me. I care for my patients equally. I eventually yielded in the conversation and said that I would follow up with my manager on Monday for a resolution to this matter. And I followed up with my manager, who agreed, but I still felt as if I was not supported. The charge nurse was never addressed on how she handled the situation. There was not a follow-up meeting, even when I stated I was majorly offended in how they handled the situation, and I feel they missed every red flag from this family. My manager talked to the director, who also agreed, but there still was no follow-up. After a week, I still was upset, so I emailed the CEO of my organization and told him of the situation. I inquired as to what was put in place to protect me as an employee from racism from patients, and what was put in place to teach management on how to deal with racism. He immediately responded and set up a meeting with the head of human resources and the VP of nursing. Prior to that meeting, I researched policies that protect employees from discrimination from patients, and to my surprise, there was none. The meeting I had with the head of human resources and the vice president of nursing was very productive and seemingly promising. They both apologized to me for the situation and immediately recognized the microaggressions. They knew the word microaggressions and actually used the word. They admitted they had no policies in place and were in the midst of major issues dealing with discrimination within the organization and from patients. I shared my findings in research. They shared that they were working with WVU's Vice President and Chief Diversity Officer and were dealing with internal structures related to hiring, as well as dealing with external processes of patient care. They assured me that workshops were coming and even invited me to assist them, in which I said I would love to be a part of that taking place. They extended their assistance to me, and if any future issues arise, to please contact them. I did leave with a sense of hope that changes would take place and management would be trained on how to deal with racism. To date, I have not seen any advertisement of workshops related to diversity training and how to deal with racism. I'm also not aware if the organization created a diversity officer and or team. That was the last one.
Thank you, Doris. Before we go into the breakout rooms and have more opportunity to discuss these clips together, I did want to address some of the questions that came up in the chat. The first one being for the Columbia Life Histories Project, are the histories archived? And yes, as an oral history project, one of the foundational parts of creating an oral history project is knowing what's going to happen with the interviews after they're recorded and after they're used for whatever book or podcast or whatever. So yes, the oral histories were all fully transcribed and are in the process of being archived in the Center for Oral History at Columbia. And the second question was from Chris. Here it is. How are histories analyzed with this format? Do you look for themes? And so speaking specifically of the Columbia Life Histories Project and the analysis that we sort of did in order to create our report to present to the dean who called for the project, we used the transcripts and we did a deep reading and re-listening of all of the interviews, looking for the specific themes that were most common amongst our narrators. And so we actually had a spreadsheet that we tracked who the person was, where they said that they were from, where they were in the university, what specific keywords or themes came up most often for them in their transcript. And so that's something we could do easily just by pulling up the Word document and searching words that we remember hearing often and seeing if it did in fact come up more often than others by doing a find and replace, for instance. That's a function you can do in Word, and allowed us to see exactly how many times someone brought something up, I'm drawing a blank right now on some of the themes, but yes, we did analyze for specific themes, and in the report, we spoke to those specific themes by using the actual stories that people shared about them as examples to really elucidate the entire process. So if there aren't any other questions, I will say that I will put the link to the clips, including clips recorded previously with Doris doing the recitations you just all heard, so that while you're in your breakout room, you can listen back to whatever clip kind of speaks to the theme of the room that you're in order to discuss it more fully with your group or just ruminate on it yourself. Is that everything, Lori?
I wanted to ask one other question. Should we explain what they're going to be doing when they come out of the breakout room, Alisa, because you're leading a session after that, is that right? So
yes. So after the breakout room, I will be asking you all to kind of share what's really on your minds and how you're feeling with the things that were discussed and the clips that you listened to. It won't be a test or anything. It'll just be more of a checking in and a grounding in this active listening, the active listening to our narrators themselves, and also the active listening to each other as we try to figure out how we feel about what it is we're listening to and what kinds of feelings that brings up in us about our own personal experiences or what it is we feel comfortable sharing, that is. And I think Kerry has some more specific instructions for what you all will do in the breakout rooms themselves.
great, thank you so much.
No problem.
Okay, I am sharing, these are the 7 breakout rooms, and I just want to clarify that while there is a room dedicated for students only, please, if students want to be a part of these other rooms, of course you're welcome into this space. We just wanted to make sure to also have a space in case students really do want to come together. And so what we'll do before we go to our breakout rooms, or I guess we can go to our breakout rooms and then maybe just take like a 5-minute break. I think we have a little bit of time to do that. Yeah, so when we go to our breakout rooms, you will have a facilitator, and they will kind of explain what's going to happen in that space. But this is really a space to sort of connect, to talk about experiences, stories related to some of these critical issues. These were 6 critical issues that were talked about from participants at the first Social Justice Summit, where we came together to identify what are the issues affecting us as faculty, staff, students, and community. At that first summit, we also talked about possible actions to address some of these. They may not look like the names of what you remember from the first summit, which is why we also shared the website sort of explaining these in more detail beforehand. Lori, or Stephanie, is there anything you want to add?
So I would just say, look carefully at the 7 areas or the 6 areas and try to think about where you want to go. Kerry, are they supposed to let you know where they want to go, or how does that work?
Great question. So this is a little bit different than maybe, especially if you've been a part of organizing Zoom breakout rooms. I have set this up so that you can self-select your room. And so actually right now, what I'm going to do is open the breakout rooms. You don't have to go to it right away. But what you should see those 7 rooms if you click on the breakout room icon in your toolbar. If your toolbar is kind of wide, you might have to click that more. Does everybody see this? These 7 rooms?
Yes.
Okay, so those rooms, I was able to rename them so that they align with these 7 groups here. So you should be able to select the one that seems like maybe you have a story that you would like to sort of talk about. Maybe you just have an interest in that particular area.
And then can we also talk about a brief timeline? So are we asking people, we're telling people they can take a break now and then come back and go to their breakout room? Can we sync our watches so that we're all on the same time? So what are we doing exactly right now? It's 2:20.
Right. And so we're a bit ahead of schedule, which is great, which is because we were worried about where to put a break into this 3-hour summit. So it looks like if everybody would like to sort of maybe just go to your breakout room so you know where you're going to be, and then our facilitators can let everybody just take a moment to take care of themselves and then come back together. I would say 5 minutes. Would that be enough time for everybody? So we could start our breakout rooms at 2:25.
Sure. So I think what we're asking you to do is sync your clocks now for 2:20, select a breakout room, and then at 2:25, the facilitators will join the breakout room. If you have any problems, stay in the main room and Kerry will help you. Is that good for everybody? I'm gonna do a thumbs up. And I am going to say, let's select our breakout rooms now.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm really sorry to have likely interrupted the middle of a conversation.
Totally interrupted us, Kerry. No.
Sorry. I'm trying to stick to the schedule. Actually, we are 10 minutes ahead of time, but we were at the 30-minute mark. So I wanted to bring everybody back, and just so we're all on the same page, we are running 10 minutes ahead of schedule, which is really odd for anything I've ever run or taught. So this is great. Alisa, I'm gonna I'm gonna give this back over to you and let you start our
Yeah.
do a whole, so I'll just let everybody know, we'll do the whole group break debrief for about 20 minutes. And then the next 20 minutes, we'd really like to talk about next steps. And then Lori will walk us through that. So I'm gonna stop sharing and turn it over to you.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. Before we get into, debriefing and sharing, I just wanted to mention the importance of being able to be anonymous and respecting that. It's the word anonymous has come up a little bit throughout the summit, throughout the sessions, and I just wanted to talk a little bit more about it. I think it's really important to be able to share and feel confident in knowing that what you share is going to be respected by the audience that does get the opportunity to listen to it. And so to know where your story is going, to have some control over where your story is going is something that's important to me as an oral historian to offer to my narrators. And so, for instance, with the Columbia Life Histories Project, many of the narrators who volunteered to be a part of the project and share their stories did request to remain anonymous, or made other similar stipulations in their legal release forms, stating things like they would love to have their interview archived, but kept closed until a period of time as they're no longer at the university, or they finish their PhDs, or whatever felt comfortable to them, whether it was being through the job hiring process and not wanting their name to come up in a Google search saying that they said all of these negative things about the university that they attended, right? Those are considerations that we take very seriously as oral historians, and I want them to be considerations you take seriously too, as I ask you to share, what you discussed in your breakout groups. Think about how you can share things in a sensitive way, or whether the things that you talked about in the group are really appropriate to share in a broader audience. You can even check in the chat, directly message the person who said something you think is important to share, and make sure it's okay with them that it's shared more broadly. Just having that type of thoughtfulness and respect for others, I think, goes a long way to creating a community that's grounded in things like diversity and inclusion. So that's my little spiel on being anonymous. And now I welcome, as we're all coming back, to think about, what is the first utmost thought that is like really just pressing on the front of your head? What is it that the word or feeling or phrase or question that you're stuck with, that just won't leave? And go ahead and put that in the chat. And it could be something as simple as a word. It could be, anything. And I'm just going to give us a couple of minutes for you to think about that and put that in. But don't think too hard. It's, again, not a quiz, not a test. If you don't want to share it broadly with the group, you can send it directly to me as well. So I'm seeing a lot of words like humility and privilege and justice. These are great. Hard, yes. Oral histories are, in fact, hard, and it's something that we do consider in practice. It's like, if you're going to schedule an interview for a day, don't schedule anything else for that day, because you don't know what's going to come up, what emotions you're going to feel, and that can be really draining. Cultural humility, lack of accountability. Yeah, these are great. There is no safe space. I am very curious about this. Beth, Torin, I believe I heard you speak a little bit in the breakout room. Is there something you can say a little bit more about to this idea of there being no safe space? Are you comfortable sharing?
I'll try to articulate that
Thank
a
you.
little better. I think there's often that an illusion of space, of safety. People are asked to be transparent, and then it can be weaponized against them. And you were just speaking to how to protect people by going on the record, or not going on the record. And yet, here's the thing: in a small place where somebody's maybe an army of one in a group, anything they say will be identified with them immediately, because they would be the only person that would say that. So that even though they might be granted some kind of anonymity, if it's shared in the circle where it can actually make a difference in their world, it's not safe for them to express it. Does that?
Yes.
Maybe you can say that better as well, or in another
No,
way.
I think you did an excellent job, and I'm sure everyone would agree. And it's a really unfortunate reality, right? That, you know, our words can be turned against us, no matter how careful we try to be in exactly how we say things, or who we say them to, or who might be listening later, whether we might be recorded without our knowledge, or if we are recorded and agree to be recorded, where that might wind up. You're right. You know, safe space is unfortunately sometimes an illusion, and that's something we have to grapple with, and we have to deal with. Thank you so much for bringing that into the room as something to consider. And Samantha says a need for safe and protected spaces. So it's like, how do we balance that, the reality that safety is kind of an illusion, but that's still desire to create space for ourselves where we do feel comfortable? How can we make ourselves more comfortable with the idea that we're never going to be perfectly safe? These are all really great things to consider. Trainings aren't enough, and that's true. That is very true. Trainings are not enough. It's a day by day changing the way that we are, that is what's really required, not just a training and a checkbox and that we did the thing and it's done. Incremental change is dangerous. Second, the bold action thoughts. Yeah. Well, I thank you all for pitching in the chat and telling us where your head is at a little bit, and I especially thank you, Beth, for making the effort to explain your thoughts. The second part of our check-in is really just, I wanted to make some time for each group, a representative from each of the breakout rooms, to kind of speak to what were the themes or the feelings that you guys discussed. If you happen to have, and I'm not saying that this should be the case, but if you had solutions or ideas for solutions even, or if you had questions that you thought the broader group might be able to talk more about, like, I wanted to give each group a time to kind of share more widely what was discussed. And I think the best way to do that is probably just to go in order of the number of the breakout rooms. And I'm not sure if your breakout room facilitator would have already selected a person to share, or if the facilitator is the one who will be sharing. But if you'd like to share for your group, you can feel free to use the raise hand icon and then share in that way. So I guess we'll start with the first group, which was naming, addressing, and enforcing the DEI efforts. And I don't know, Stephanie, if you
Does
had a
anybody
chance to do that.
Does anybody from our group want to talk, or does anybody, we forgot to talk about that. We gotta
That's
go.
okay.
Does anybody want to talk? Tony, you had some great points. Do you want to talk about it, or I can go through our notes? You guys want to let me know?
I'm okay with you talking.
Okay. I don't want to do all the talking. Okay, so we had a okay, good. We had a wonderful conversation, and you guys, anybody who was in our group, jump in if I missed something. We really talked about how the name of DEI is not so important, because sometimes that comes up, and while changing the name can be great, or rebranding it, but it was really more about the need to frame diversity through fostering a culture of inclusion, having goals that are above and beyond what our state demographics show. We should be trying to exceed those things, and we should be making an environment where it's welcoming for students of color, for faculty of color, for staff. And we need to also create an environment that, if it's truly supportive of inclusion, diversity, and equity, where those who speak up do not become othered, and where we simply don't treat that person differently, but we really truly address the issues that have been raised by that person. One of the other things we talked about was that comprehensive training, and Tony had a great point about the training. Tony, do you want to kind of jump in on what you thought we should do with training?
Well, I don't know that I can own that thought, but it was just a recognition that if we're going to suggest that our culture needs to change, then we have to change our culture. And we're not going to change our culture unless the entire university is committed to doing so. And part of that would be, training. Training certainly isn't enough. It has to turn into action, right? But you have to start somewhere. And, the division of diversity, equity, and inclusion cannot accomplish it on its own. DEI has to filter out through the entire university, through our student organizations, through our colleges, to our faculty, to our staff, and our students. And then it needs to branch out from there to our state, right? And that was one of Stephanie's points. So there's so much that needs to be done, and we actually need more people at the table so that we can get it done.
Thank you. That was awesome. And one of the final topics we talked about, because I don't want to take up all the time for our group, was that there's not a lot of protection for faculty, that we talk about needing cultural shifts in curriculum. We talk about needing to, change the way we teach and doing all these things. But as faculty members, we put ourselves out there, and we're at risk for being criticized or even punished through SCIs or other methods when we try to teach these concepts that people are not open to. And so we had some suggestions in the group. Tony just mentioned one is like changing the way we do training, changing the way we evaluate things, bringing awareness first. I think that was a point that we heard it several times in the group, is that we really need to bring awareness first, and people need to become aware for us to have really good inclusion, diversity, and equity. And then I think one of the only other things I wanted to mention was people don't feel like there's a good reporting system. So they feel as if when something happens to them, there is not a reporting system that protects the victim or aids the victim. Instead, again, to mention what I said before, they feel that they become othered or they're not believed. And so that really takes away from any feeling of inclusion. And that's all for group number 1.
Thank you so much for sharing, Stephanie, and Tony as well. I did drop in on your group a little bit, and I know KZip shared some really great things, and she also shared here in the chat the words bold action. And I was wondering if she could speak to that a little bit more as well.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So I'm KZip. I'm actually a graduate student who didn't go into the student group. when I say bold action, I think it's comes from a frustration of seeing a diversity committee made and then nothing happening. And then constantly checking in and then hearing nothing's happening. And I think we spend as academics a lot of time talking because we really want the best work of action. And maybe it's because I'm a scientist, but I understand that everything's an experiment. And so we need to take these experimental actions and then sit back and see how it worked. And I know with sensitive topics, we're afraid sometimes because, you know, we're afraid that we won't make the right move or that it'll move in, you know, another direction. But every step is a step. And I think by at least showing that we're making a step to do something, it might help eliminate some of this, well, God, why is nothing happening? And so that's what I mean by bold action, is to not sit there and plan it to death for months and months at a time and to just go and do it. Recently, I randomly started a student conference. I didn't mean to. I had no plans to. It just happened and it turned into a national conference. And I think part of me is motivated by that, in saying that one small little pebble can roll down and turn into a huge snowball. And so that's kind of why I was saying bold action.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate you sharing that. It does remind me of one of our anonymous clips, the last one that Doris read, where the staff member is talking about, you know, an incident she felt was racist and the actions she purposefully made to hold people accountable, to reach out. First, it was her floor manager. Then it was, you know, all the way up to the HR and sitting down for meetings. Just that constant persistence. I think that speaks to the same idea of being bold and taking action. So thank you so much for sharing that. Let's go on to group 2, which was racism and retaliation. Jerry, do you guys have someone who wants to share?
I guess I got nominated, and so thank you for giving me the floor. And I did put in the chat that I thought my group was wonderful, and I just want to say that publicly out loud to everyone that I really, really appreciated everybody's input. I'm going to do my best to represent that. Anybody who wants to chime in, please do. If you feel like there's another thing to add to it. What I want to say though is, first, let me recognize the group that just went before me. Although we were talking about racism and retaliation, a lot of the discussion looked very similar to like what was going on in that group. It's just that it was with regards to the racism retaliation piece. So let me tell you what I mean by that. First, we started off by discussing some broad issues that are out there, stories that we've heard, places where, everything from students to staff to everything else, something happened, they reported it, or they couldn't figure out how to report it, and they were very much concerned about retaliation. That was some of the central themes that started that conversation. So we dug deeper after we went through that and just talked about like how does that process work? What do we do to fix it? But mainly spending a lot of time talking about how does that process works and how we feel about it. Some of the things that came out of that discussion was just that, people didn't know where to go. People didn't know who to trust. They felt like there was a lack of transparency when you start talking about these type of things, and trying to expose some of these issues. And we even got into a great discussion about how, can these processes that we have with the quasi-legal framework, are they inherently just doomed to fail, when it's all said and done, just because of the way they're structured? There's two things I guess I'll end with. One is that several people, and not even just in this group, but in other conversations I've had, they've expressed the fact that this makes them want to just not be part of that particular system. You know, you get into this business because you want to help people, but then you get labeled as, you know, as something that doesn't take action, that doesn't do it. And then you got to ask yourself, how culpable am I for being a part of this? And, you know, so I've had, you know, everyone from students, faculty to administrators, and, you know, just all talk about this idea of, you know, is this where we belong? Should we be here? Does this fight even make sense? And I'm, you know, in my heart of hearts, I'm hoping that somebody who's in charge of doing something about this actually hears that, you know, that they got to get used to the fact that there are people who are here, they're thinking about leaving and never coming back. There are people who are thinking about coming here but chose not to. Like, all these things are fair game right now because of the way we look on the outside. And I think the last thing I'll throw out there is, as we talk about solutions, I'll just make this one last point. When you were talking about what the name DEI, everybody recognizes that somebody needs to have the word justice in their name, you know, DEI-J or something to that effect, where there's basically this restorative nature on how to make things right. Maybe that is hopefully outside the quasi-legal structure that's already out there, but something has to be done to address justice. And there's not a clear path on how to do that. So I think that's my report out.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that. I especially loved, you mentioned this term twice, this quasi-legal type of existence we have on university campuses, right? And it's mind-boggling to me how we can all know that our criminal justice system is, you know, failing, and that court systems, you know, aren't necessarily the best at representing people of color. And then we still use that same type of system and same type of framework in the places where we're supposed to be teaching, and specifically teaching also people of color, right? So it's a little ironic, and I appreciate you using that term. It's definitely something I'll be thinking about going forward from here. So yes, moving on to group 3, which was recruitment and retention with Elizabeth as the leader. Do you guys have anyone who wants to share in particular?
Okay, that's a housekeeping piece we didn't do, so I'll go ahead and share. And thanks to everyone who participated. So what some of the final conclusions are, the first thing is commitment. And I think that's commitment from central administration as well as middle management. And here are the areas that I believe the group spoke about. Investing in the initiatives in terms of funding for recruitment and funding for retention is critically important. Commitment to hiring. And once hired, there has to be some protections in place, some mentoring. There has to be some protections in place so that there aren't bait and switching taking place in terms of recruiting faculty members under one cloud of understanding, and when the person gets to campus, there's 5 other assignments. So that's a part of the protection. The other thing, there has to be a commitment where not only is it central, it has to be unit level. There are people on the campus who believe while there may be central leadership, but at the local level it's lacking. No one talks about diversity and inclusion. So what's the overview, and how do those commitments move down into the lower levels of the university? The other thing would be, let's see. I think the major thing here is let's stop talking. There's more talk and less action. And finally, in order to hold folks accountable, there needs to be data. This is one of the things that I suggest. When you say you want to recruit, to what extent do you want to recruit? Where are the areas that are underrepresented, and by how many? What's the margin? Let's focus on metrics, and then we can hold folks accountable, even from productivity. what's the productivity and who's doing the producing. Even at the university, what units are have local committees looking at diversity in each of the departments, each of the colleges. What does it look like? What's the landscape? Let's do a landscape and get some data to determine where the gaps are, the equity gaps. And I believe that's it. If there are any other members of the group who want to chime in, please do.
Yes, thank you. If there are any other members of the group who want to chime in, again, feel free to use the raise hand function, or you can even type it into the chat. I really do, I got to sit in on Elizabeth's group as well. And this idea of commitment, it's really important. It's, you know, a commitment that not only the university has to make to these principles of diversity and inclusion, but it's a commitment like we have to make with each other as well, to hold each other accountable, and to have good and clear communication about that, where, you know, we don't feel like we're going to be retaliated against always. And that's just so hard to really stick to, right? So thank you guys from group 3. Moving on to group 4, invisible and uncompensated labor. Tiffany was leading that group. Tiffany, do y'all have anyone who wants to share?
We too also ran out of time.
See, I tried to tell Kerry that we should have been in breakout groups longer.
That's a running theme. Put that down. But I'll just share out a few points, and then of course, as always, the dope group, group 4 represent, please feel free to jump in and share more. So one we talked about, and it was in bouncing off of Belinda's story that was shared, this constant asking for Black and underrepresented individuals to share their stories and their voices, and there's no accountability on the other end of that. We discussed, you know, putting students, staff, and faculty in these awkward positions of sharing their story, of serving on committees, providing solutions, and then not being acknowledged, and what it's giving up to be in those spaces, and also not being compensated, and not just monetarily, but also for their time. And so then an interesting conversation came up about this kind of focus on value and not cost, and what Black and underrepresented individuals are giving up to be in those spaces, how they're put in them, what they're giving up to be in them, and then what happens after. There's also, in terms of that invisible labor, there's that Black and underrepresented faculty tend to engage a lot more in DEI efforts and mentorship of students and students of color and underrepresented students, and how that does take away from the work that is privileged in promotion and tenure, and a need to reevaluate PNT system to honor that in real concrete ways, not just like this one sentence type of deal. And then also another conversation emerged about what is the role of co-conspirators and allyship. So what does it mean for people to like be suggesting Black and underrepresented individuals to be participating in these spaces or being mentors, and what can they be doing while they're in those spaces? Because it's like this tension of, we need people in the space, but then when they get in the space, like people have mentioned, they're not protected, they're not compensated for their time and value and their ideas, and they're not recognized for it. And so it's this tension of, do they be at the table, do they not? Are we allowed to say no? It was a lot of really interesting stories being shared and experiences related to that. I think I got it all. Let me know, group 4, if there's anything else.
Thank you. What you did share, I thought was a lot. Like, I kept hearing things that I wanted to comment about, and I had to zone myself back into actually listening to what else you had to say. But for instance, this idea of value versus cost, I think that that's something that probably speaks to some of the subjects other groups talked about that I got to listen in on, because the idea is like, we need funding, right, in order to have these great initiatives and do all of these things that we want to do. But there is a difference between value and cost, and what can we do to kind of make that knowledge more widely known. I also liked what you were saying now about allyship. Yes. And what does it really mean to be an ally, to stand up for other people who are going through what they're going through, not just in these meetings, not just in trainings, but in the moment, right? I think that's an important part of allyship, that it happens every single day. And that's something that we can continue to push forward with as well. Listening is a form of allyship. Being the ear for someone who's going through something, that's a form of allyship. But then also, again, like Kazip said, having bold action that follows it, right? So thank you so much, Tiffany, for sharing for group 4. Okay, has a comment in the chat as well. As a scientist, something I debate with is, do I put this work on my CV? Will it be valued enough by fellow scientists? Will this be used against me in the hiring process? If it was, is that a space I want to work in? Thank you, Kazip, for putting that in the chat. I think that is an important thing that we're all struggling with, right? It's like, what do others want from me, right, to make me hireable? What am I putting on my CV to make me hireable in the positions that I want? And what places do I want to be? These are all really, really great questions. And I will say this, I'm not a scientist, but I do happen to be friends with some scientists and related to some scientists, and they're all super into this work too. So I feel like there's gotta be a place for you guys. Yeah, so moving on to group 5, barriers to shared voice and power. Lori, this was your group. Would you like to share, or did you have anyone in your group who wants to share specifically?
So I want to find out if Spencer's still here. He had to leave at 3. Probably he's gone. We had a very small group. And I just want to thank the people who showed up for participating. Some of the things we talked about had to do with actual representation in terms of numbers. So we had someone who spoke about the fact that they had 32 foreign nationals and then 9 members of the majority, but that none of the foreign nationals were ever given positions of responsibility. And then what's more, if you don't get that position of responsibility in the first instance, by the time you reach the second and the third instance, you're simply told you don't have the experience. And so how do you get that experience? And so one of the solutions we talked about, and I don't know that this one was accepted, is do you put into place hiring procedures? But by that, I mean, we're going to post these positions. We're going to make sure we interview X number of candidates who are minorities versus X number of candidates who are from the majority. And we're going to be filling these positions this year. There are 5 of them. And we are dedicated to making sure that 3 of them are underrepresented, come from underrepresented groups or something like that. I simply say that to say that when the system fails to function based on ethical principles, then you have to resort to numbers and rules and policies. And that is the way things generally work in any given legal system that you have to rely on. We talked about the concept of othering, being in meetings and having others define you so that you fit into their category that they need you to fit into. We also talked about invisibility, being in spaces where you make a presentation or you say something and you are simply ignored as if you said nothing. One of the solutions we talked about, again, and this is this one is not a legal solution, but it's the idea of marrying good values, proper behavior. If someone says something and you can mirror good behavior, respond to that, form an alliance with that person, hopefully that courtesy will be extended back to you. Don't know if that actually works or not, but someone suggested it. Last, I would say that Spencer Darden was in our group from DEI, and he briefly described the new DEI council. And we specifically asked him if this new council was going to be celebratory in nature, speaking about all of the good things that happened with DEI at the university. And he assured us that the purpose of this new group was not simply to phone in the good news about diversity, equity, and inclusion, but to deal with tough issues. And we found that exciting and are looking forward to the formation of that council. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you for all of that you shared. For such a small group, you guys got through a lot. And let's move on to group 6, White Fragility. Melanie.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, group 6, as well as all the other groups who are sharing your labor and your work. And I know a lot of this work is also emotionally draining as well. So to Tiffany's point of valuing the work, appreciate everybody being on this call as well as the organizers. So our group talked about that white fragility is also co with white privilege, right? And that how do you sort of navigate a space in which it's actually going to be difficult for you potentially as a white person, but the focus cannot be on the white person's tears, right? The focus cannot be on the white person's difficulty. And so one of the things that we're going to have to do is make sure that we have a community for white people to support each other, but that the forward of the face is on the people of color's experience, right? That it's not put back on our experiences, because there will be a loss of relationships potentially within your circles of people who you thought were allies or people who you thought were woke, and then there'll be people who are straight out racist, right? That they may be in your family, and so there will be relationships that you will lose. And right, being able to support that's going to happen, but that the focus can't be on that as allies in this fight. The other thing we talked about was that, and this was on the summit, from the first summit as well, is that defensiveness is often the first reaction of white people, and that one of the things that we can do as white people is to be quiet when we get feedback or hear feedback and not immediately say, but I didn't mean it, or but this, or but that, or right, but that's not true, or right, but there's another story to that. And that if you do something that is racist or is not supportive and somebody tells you about that, you need to apologize, right? And you need to expect nothing back from the person you apologize to, because that's not their responsibility to make you feel better. It's your responsibility to have the humility to say, I am sorry, and I'm going to practice and do better. We talked about that one of the things that if you're able to do financially is to support the work of groups of color that are already doing this kind of work. And so that there are organizations, because one of the things, right, that white people tend to do is not listen. I think, Alisa, you talked about that we don't listen to the women of color who are speaking to us. Are there organizations that are already out there doing this work? So Jerry's the president of NAACP, right? Can you make a donation to NAACP if you are financially able to do that, right? Supporting that work. Be aware of what you don't know. So most of us, except for Tiffany, because this is her area of expertise, we have terrible social history, right? We And I know Tiffany's group works really hard to change the K through 12 system, but those of us on this call came up through a very biased system. If you're a parent and you have children in the system now, push back, right? If your student gets bad history, right, make a change. And then we talked about constantly, we need to learn a lot more. Like, even if you think you know a lot, you don't know a lot as a white person. And so you have to, I think somebody brought up earlier, read scholars of color, right? Read what people are saying, understand what people are saying, educate yourself. And the other point was be humble, right? Like, we're used to being bosses and in charge, and this is not the space for us to do that. Like, we have to be humble and really listen. So I think that was our group summary. If I missed anything, group, chime in.
Thank you so much, Melanie. That was an excellent summary. And you said so many things that I found myself really agreeing with. Even for myself, like, I tried to read more Black writers because it didn't occur to me until recently that most of the books on my bookshelves weren't written by Black women. And I made a conscious effort to try and change that, just one step at a time. And so that's a really great point. All of your points really fantastic. So thank you. Finally, we have our student group, Darian. I'm sorry, I don't know how to pronounce your name. Please correct me.
You were pretty close. So we
wait, no, but please tell me.
Ignore the E on the end. Just Darian.
Darian. Okay, thank you.
Yeah. So there were two. We talked about a lot of things, but there's two kind of emerging themes that came out of this. And if anybody wants to chime in, please feel free. I would say the overarching idea is a frustration with the university. They talked about a lack of diversity and representation on campus in general, which we know, but to even go further, that one of the excuse me, a participant said something like DayVU has all these signs and buttons and messaging about diversity and we have all of this and we have all of that, but there's no action anywhere. And then if the university isn't acting on these incidents, how are they as change agents supposed to know how to act if they've never seen an example of how to act? So they want to act, but they don't know how. And then last but not least, something that we spent a lot of time on is the university needs to take initiative on some sort of diversity, cultural competency course. A training is not enough. It needs to be mandatory. And if it can't be mandatory, it needs to be in every single class. We spend a lot of time on that.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that. It's always really great to hear from students and younger people with fresh takes and things like that. So thank you, Group 7. And with that, that's, our debrief. I do know we wanted to have a little bit of time at the end, Kerry, for closure and next steps. So I suppose I will turn it over to you. I just want to thank everyone for their willingness to share, their openness, and their participation, not just in the breakout groups, but in talking back later. Thank you. Also, I'll put my email address in the chat if you want to ask any questions offline.
Thank you so much, everybody. I was in the main room doing the technical background, so I didn't get to hear these wonderful conversations. So I was just like listening intently and wow, just wow. So without further ado, Lori, would you like to go ahead and bring some closure to our summit and talk about next steps?
Sure, thank you for that. I am deeply grateful to everyone who showed up today. And comments about uncompensated labor, I strongly identify with those. But there's something about this work that we do. We showed up today, right? This was a non-teaching day, but we all showed up today to do this. And so the notion of uncompensated labor really speaks more to other ideas, being invisible, not having a seat at the table, not having people represent you, feeling like you're toiling and there is no appreciation for that toiling. We do the work, we show up because we care deeply. And I just want to recognize that you showed up and you work with us to do this labor that we feel is extremely important. And the question of compensation really speaks more to, does it count in our folder, in our digital measures folder? Does anyone say thank you? When we talk about these ideas among ourselves, because now we've got groups, right? We've got all kinds of groups so we can talk to ourselves. But when we talk, who's responding back? Right? So we're not necessarily talking about paying us. We're talking about recognition and appreciation and integration of ideas. Structures, right? I heard a lot about structures. What structures do we have in place so that convenings like this go somewhere? Are we still talking to ourselves right now? That's a form of uncompensation. Just having a group made over here and you're told, you go meet with that group and we'll get back to you. That's uncompensated labor. That's a lack of appreciation. That is putting you over to the side and saying, you've got your group, now go to it. I want to assure you that we are deeply appreciative of your effort today. And I can feel it. I feel that people showed up because they wanted to do this work. So thank you. Thank you very much. Going back to structures, that's supremely important. They're missing. Structures that connect the top to the bottom are broken, non-existent, or missing. And we're aware of that. Performative, what do we do next? As a Senate faculty committee, we are writing a report. And we will be taking your recommendations and your experiences and integrating them. So in this case, stories are activism, and we will be using them to support the recommendations that we make. And we will be doubling down on our efforts to make sure that our voices are heard and that they move up the ladder. We're committed to that as a committee, and it's extremely important to us. Next steps, we are planning a survey. We really want to know if you want to help in our writing of the report. And so in that survey, we'll be asking a number of questions. We want your feedback, and we want to know if you want to continue to work with us in some way. And so please look for that survey. If you don't get the survey, or if you get off of this convening and you want to reach out to any one of us right away, email us. I think everybody has an email address, but if not, maybe Kerry and Stephanie can put our email addresses in chat. You don't have to wait for the survey. Reach out to us. It's fine. We are interested in hearing from you. I want to recognize some people that I saw that are present, and one of them, I don't know if I'm going to call out Kerry Woodbury because she's a significant participant from the Health Sciences Center. So Kerry, hi. Thank you so much for coming today and participating. We really appreciate it. We know that the med school and the School of Nursing and the School of Pharmacy all have different schedules, that you have a different schedule and a lot of responsibility. And so when you take time out to join, we really appreciate that. So I wanted to recognize that. There are others here that participated, and I know their schedules are crazy. And so we really, really appreciate that participation as well. With that, I think I'm going to close it out and say thank you again. Please look for that survey. We welcome your continued participation. And please know that we valued your input today and your ongoing alliance with us as the Senate Faculty Committee on Inclusion and Diversity. Thank you, everyone.